Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. Hope you're ready for what we think is going to be a really fun week around here. We have our eyes on the possibility of a couple of commits, perhaps to be added for Georgia, one for the class of 2025, of course, believe it or not, perhaps one for the class of 2024 still there as well. More details on that coming up in a moment. Big story of the weekend was also Georgia adding a major defensive back prospect, flipping him from an SEC rival, we'll call him a rival in air quotes here, in the process. So a lot on that today, plus Jon Stinchcomb stops by. We're a week away from the start of SEC Media Days. You can just sort of really feel it that the 2024 season is right here at the doorstep, and we are excited about all of that. We're also excited about having you with us for the program today, so what do you say we get it started? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Stop me if you've heard this before. We're expecting a busy day for Georgia recruiting. Now, it's already a busy weekend, and a lot today on the program coming up in a couple of minutes. And Shamari Earls, I think this is sizable news for Georgia on a couple of fronts. We'll certainly get to that throughout the program. Jon Stinchcomb, by the way, stops by as well here in a moment. You've got your eye on the four-star safety, Jaylan Morgan, getting ready to commit later on this afternoon. Georgia thought to be in a pretty good spot for this from the young man from the kind of central part of Tennessee. So we'll keep our eye on Morgan here and talk more about that in a moment. Let's also talk to you for the time being about Jahzare Jackson. Now, as we sit here at the 10 a.m. hour, it is very unusual for us to have anything that sort of feels like breaking news during the 10 a.m. hour. Like once or twice, maybe three times a year, there'll be action occurring during our show. This sort of late morning time in which we broadcast the show live is typically a time to sort of either talk about what has happened or will happen. Very rarely is it a time to talk about what is currently happening. But in this particular case, that may be what's going down here today. Georgia might be ready to add a guy in Jackson who has a very interesting backstory. And Jeff Sentell has obviously chronicled some of this for us on DawgNation.com and stories that he's written, or his program Before the Hedge is presented by Kroger. But Jackson has been a basketball player, participating in the Overtime Elite program. He's like 6'10", which would make him, I think, tallest player in Georgia history. You got Dennis Rowland and Bernard Williams, guys like that, who've been pretty tall. But I believe Jackson officially, assuming the 6'10" is accurate, and I believe that it is, he'd end up being, the tallest guy to ever play at Georgia if he does indeed make his pledge for the Dogs here coming up in a moment. Now, as many of you are aware, one of the things that makes the Jackson thing a little bit interesting is the fact that he's a class of 2024 prospect, technically, officially, that we're kind of fixated on what's happening for Georgia in its current cycle, 2025, thinking ahead to December and the start of the early signing period and things like that. But Jackson would officially be a part of the class of 2024. He is also, I think, to be fair, he's also, to be fair, I think a little bit, and by the way, we do now have it official. It is coming out, I guess, on 3 and others reporting this, that Jackson now has committed to the University of Georgia. So Jahzare Jackson, officially now a member of this 2024 class for Georgia, 6'10", 340 pounds, out of San Diego, California, and a part of the Overtime Elite basketball program there. A guy who, perhaps thought his future was in the NBA draft, will now give his shot there at football. Not a highly rated player because he hasn't played really, any football to speak of, but obviously the kind of body that certainly becomes pretty interesting for a football program to get a chance to use, and it'll be Georgia that does that. So your question is, especially if you've only kind of loosely followed this story, or perhaps you only casually follow recruiting, is what does this all mean for Georgia to add a guy who's 6'10" and 340 pounds to the current class? He'll essentially enroll at Georgia right away and show up on campus essentially right now, to get ready for fall camp, which comes up in a few weeks. Like, what does this mean for Georgia? Totally fair question. Here's what I think it means from my, perspective. there's a very good chance that Jahzare Jackson never plays a significant snap at all for Georgia. You just have to be realistic about that. That for someone like this who doesn't have a football background, predicting how he'll perform at a place like Georgia, that'd be a very difficult task to try to undertake. And if you wanted to be somewhat skeptical about all of that, you would have, reason perhaps for feeling that way. But to me, this sort of shows how the gears turn at a place like Georgia. It kind of shows the thought process at a place like UGA. And this is one of the things, and we talk about this stuff from time to time, this is one of the things that just sort of makes Georgia, Georgia. Georgia, seemingly, the best we can tell, works as hard on the guy that sort of rounds out the 85th spot on the roster, or in some cases the 90th spot on the roster. Georgia works just as hard on evaluating that spot as it does the 4- and 5-star prospects who perhaps go on to be first-round draft picks. That there's a certain level of prospect that everybody wants, and so therefore Georgia chases those guys oftentimes harder than anyone else is capable of, and we see the fruits of all of that. But on the other side of the roster, there's also a certain level of creativity that Georgia goes through with its scouting process to say, this guy hasn't been a football player before, but what kind of football player could he be? Or this guy wasn't playing high school football at a very high level and doesn't seem to be getting a lot of other attention from other programs, but what do we perhaps see that other programs don't see? We've talked about those scouting wins for Georgia in the past here. And so that, to me, is the thing that I find so interesting about all of this, is that while there's a very good chance that Jahzare Jackson is not a big-time player at a place like Georgia, that his lack of experience from football just makes it too difficult to make the transition. Certainly a chance that's true. But when you're taking care of your business in other areas, when your 2024 class was sewn up and locked down many months ago, it gives you the freedom to say, what's still out there? And what kind of aisles can we still go shopping in? And when you're doing well with the class of 2025, when you're planting seeds and developing roots for the class of 2026, once again, you've got the freedom to sort of explore here and take a best player available project type opportunity here. And that's what Jackson brings to the table. Really intriguing size, kind of a fascinating story overall, the former basketball player trying to make that transition. Sometimes we think about the connection between, like, say, basketball and defensive line. In this case, we might be saying that when it comes to the offensive line position. Can the big 6'10" guy, can he get down and really bend his hips? I guess we'll find out. He'll either be taught to do that, or perhaps he's showing more ability to do that than sometimes you might think that long, lanky frame might be able to provide here. But a pretty interesting story and a little bit of a creative attempt at Georgia to try to maximize its roster value. Certainly a very big prospect, and by big, I mean size-wise, on his way to the Dogs. Now, quickly, let me also transition to this. This, believe it or not, is not the only prospect that Georgia might be looking to add here. This, though, as we transition, a little bit more of a traditional story. Georgia could be in line to add a commitment from a 4-star safety later on this afternoon as a Jaylan Morgan, who's kind of from that central part of Tennessee, as he gets ready to make his commitment announcement. I'll show you on the screen here what Morgan is getting ready to decide between Georgia and Florida, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss. Those are the 4 schools on the table here for Morgan here later on this afternoon. I believe it's 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern, as he gets ready to make his choice. We talked with Jeff Sintel about this on Friday a little bit, that for all the discussion about what Georgia's building for its class of 2025, the position group that has been a little slower to come together is the defensive secondary. Now, some of that's because perhaps Georgia's got 2 new coaches working there with T-Rob and Dante Williams. Some of that's because of the truly historic haul that Georgia's brought in at the defensive back position over the course of the last couple of cycles. Whatever the reasons are, though, it's been true that we've heard a little bit less about the defensive secondary than we have from some other position groups. Morgan, though, could be another kind of response to all of that Georgia's now ready to kind of fill out that portion of its roster for the 2025 class the same way that it has other position groups. And truly, this will be one that DawgNation is watching very closely as we head towards the afternoon, and perhaps a continuation of some momentum for Georgia when it comes to the defensive secondary. Because perhaps you're aware, I'm sure you probably are, Georgia also added a major commitment in the defensive secondary, and it was a flip away from another SEC program this past weekend, that in the person of Shamari Earls. And that is a story we need to talk a whole lot more about. But first, let me take some time to introduce the show. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Happy to have you with us, no matter how you may get to us today. We're live on video 10 a.m. We're on the radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, or as a podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com, posting the show there each and every day. So if you watch a portion of the video, you want to go back and listen to the full show, one of the best ways to catch up on that doesn't really require you to do a lot of extra searching is just to simply go to DawgNation.com. You'll see the show posted, Georgia Football Podcast. We have, since 2015, been labeling it very simple and directly there like that. You can click into the post, click into the show, and now you're listening to it and getting a chance to hear everything from today's show. So if you watch a portion of the video and you say, I wonder what BA was saying about blah, 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 well, that's the best way to go back, get caught up, and hear all of that. You get a chance to do that each and every day. By the way, huge thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia for making the show possible. I love what they do for people because when it comes to being a homeowner, one of the things that is important is taking the best possible care of your home that you can for a couple of reasons. A, it's the source of your deepest sort of emotional connections, where you're making your memories. This is literally your home, but it's also perhaps one of your most significant financial investments there as well. And so making sure that it looks as good as it can on the outside, feels as good as it can on the inside, obviously that's one of those things you just definitely want to do. And that's what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. And so if you're ready to kind of keep the energy on the inside of your house where it's supposed to be, especially right now, AC bills expensive. The electric bills are expensive because the air conditionings are running so frequently. Well, listen, don't waste your money on improperly, fitted windows or poorly sealed doors or anything like that. Make sure you kind of keep your energy bills as low as they possibly can be by having the most energy efficient home you possibly can have. And that is what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is also about. And if you just want to make your home look good on the outside, either be a good neighbor or kind of perhaps increase your resale value, things like that. Well, once again, all the more reason why it's time for you to have a conversation with one of those Pella experts. You can do that in person right there at their Experience Center in Duluth. I think it's a great place to be. We've been there before. I like to put my hands on things, sort of feel it, touch it, figure out what it's all about. And obviously, when you're there at the Experience Center, you get a chance to do that. They'll also come out and visit you. It's a no-pressure consultation. They don't want to push you towards something. They just simply want to inform you about why Pella Window and Door of Georgia truly is viewed to be the best. They can also give you information on special savings right now between now and the end of the month, July 31st. If you buy 4 windows, you can get 1 free. You can also get 0% APR for the next 4 years there as well. So great way to get your product paid for, great way to get some special savings. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about that. You can give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. You can also find them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. That's pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Quick programming note from me, then we're going to roll on with the rest of the show, including Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in a couple of moments. Obviously, this is a normal week for us. And then the next couple of weeks after that, going to get a little bit weird. First of all, next week is SEC Media Days. We're really excited about that. So in the spot that you normally find DawgNation Daily, this is going to be true on both video and podcast, we're going to be doing some special programming around SEC Media Days. I'm going to be a part of some of that, but I'll be doing that remotely. I'm going to be on board Utopia of the Seas. Many of you know that, the debut of this gorgeous new cruise ship from Royal Caribbean. Really excited about representing DawgNation on board there. And so that's what we're going to do. Then the week after that, I'm also gone there as well for a completely different reason, unrelated to work. And so we got some special programming coming up the following week too. So this is sort of the first time we've ever really done anything like this, trying to make you fully aware of it, that I'll be sort of briefly involved, hopefully, in each day's show, but ultimately just some special programming, completely different than DawgNation Daily, but we are going to put it on video live at 10 a.m., and we are, for the first time ever, going to make it a part of the DawgNation Daily podcast feed just for a couple of weeks. On the other side of that, we'll be full go and ready to go for the start of fall camp and everything else. But as many of you are aware, we've got 2 unusual weeks coming up, kind of unavoidable for me. And so that's the story there on that. More details on that, obviously, as we get closer. But for now, though, let's get ready to go around the doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. Y'all know how much I love Dr. Pepper, and we love having them as a part of Around the Doghouse. Let me tell you what else I love. I love Georgia flipping away 4-star defensive backs from SEC foes. And that's what happened on Sunday when Shamari Earls kind of made it official that he was leaving South Carolina's 2025 class and joining up for Georgia's class. Now, let me talk about Earls in particular, and then I want to talk about a kind of a larger, bigger picture story on this too. I think the thing that you like most about Earls is his size. Obviously kind of coming in at about 6'2", that long body, the ability to run, that's just sort of the thing that feels like an SEC defensive back, an SEC cornerback perhaps, and in a place like Georgia, that's what Earl's going to have a chance to do. Bring that long frame and kind of, be a part of, obviously a defensive secondary that's gotten very used to having great success year after year after year. So the first thing that'll jump out to you about Earl's is that size. It's 6'2". That's the kind of sort of, it's like you go to the amusement park, something like that. You got to be this tall to ride this ride. These days, when it comes to the cornerback spot, it just seems like taller is better, and that's what Earls brings to the table. But the other thing about Earls here is, which I think is kind of interesting, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody or anything like that, but if you think about like another sort of tallish cornerback that Georgia's brought in recent years, a guy like, say, Jaheim Singletary, once again, not picking on him or, not, calling him out, but that's a guy I think if we're being honest, we'd say didn't probably find his home at Georgia, didn't really quite fit in here as well as he could. And I think one of the things that ultimately became a problem for Singletary, at 6'2", when he checked in at Georgia, he's only like about, 170, 170-something pounds, something like that. In the case of Earls, he's 200-plus pounds right now, we're led to believe. And so, for a guy that got to be able to jam guys in the line of scrimmage, got to have a little bit of that toughness, even as a cornerback guy, to make those open field tackles. I think that's what Earls has a chance to bring to the table here, someone who's tall enough but also perhaps big enough to really be what the position requires here in the SEC. That's, I believe, one of the things to really like about Earls. But the other thing here is I think this is going to end up being credited as a really nice win for his brand-new cornerbacks coach. That's Dante Williams. And listen, Georgia's been on kind of an interesting run when it comes to the cornerbacks coaching spot. You got a guy like Jamal Adai, probably, if we're being honest, once again, not a successful hire, didn't really last very long here. In response to that, you bring in a guy like Fran Brown. If you want to be completely honest about Fran Brown, you can make the case that Brown perhaps was too good of a hire because pretty quickly when he got in here, you sort of realize, this is the sort of upwardly mobile guy who's going to be a head coach sooner rather than later. He made it very clear while he was at UGA, that was his intention to get a head coaching job. And today, Fran Brown is a head coach here in the Power Four. That's the sort of springboard that Georgia provides. It's also the kinds of coaches that Georgia's bringing in. And Brown, as much as anybody, came here, utilized his time at Georgia, and now is one of those guys that's sort of thought to be an up-and-coming head coach as he gets ready to begin his first season there at Syracuse. That's what that was. So a guy that was so good that you had to go out and hire his replacement here pretty quick. And so that creates a situation for Dante Williams. And Williams sort of steps in, trying to feel his way around the SEC, sort of figure out what that's all about. Georgia fans also trying to figure out what Williams is also about there as well. But it certainly seems like he has done a great job in the way that he's recruited Shamari Earls. And perhaps the best example of that is the fact that Earls, as Jeff Sentell would tell it, was so clear that he didn't really need to be a part of South Carolina's 2025 class anymore. And the strongest potential competitor, along with Georgia for Earls, was seemingly falling by the wayside there as well. That, to me, speaks to the job that Dante Williams did in recruiting Earls. And let's go back to Friday when Jeff Sentell was sort of talking about the status of Earls and his relationship with South Carolina and the status of Earls and his relationship with Michigan ahead of what turned out to be a pledge to Georgia over the weekend. This is what Jeff Sentell said on Friday.
Can call this, Brennan, a silent decommitment, because that's what it feels like to me. He's definitely, and he never really, according to my records and information, he never really got back to South Carolina for an official visit in the month of June. So that's a little weird to see that, how Georgia got an official visit, a team that he's not even committed to in the month of June. And then with Shamari, he won't go see Michigan again. He's told reporters and a couple of outlets that he won't even go see Michigan again unless he eventually would decide to make a decision to choose Michigan.
So listen, this is one of those things that you sometimes see with Georgia, and you have seen this a good bit in the class of 2025, and now you see Dante Williams getting his chance to take credit for one of these kinds of wins. The sort of decisive moments in which Earls may be technically committed to South Carolina, but the Gamecocks couldn't even get the official visit, that Michigan technically was supposed to be the strongest competitor along with Georgia for Earls, and yet they weren't slated to get another visit unless Earls made the commitment to Michigan. What that sort of leads you is to believe is that Georgia was winning with Earls so resoundingly, didn't need to see Columbia again, didn't need to see Ann Arbor again, that Earls was sure he wanted to come to Georgia. It takes an effective recruiting pitch to create that level of certainty in the mind of a prospect, but apparently that's what Dante Williams did. So let's make sure we give him credit for that here today, kind of earning a positive reputation as he kind of moves through his first cycle here at Georgia by bringing in a guy like Shamari Earls, and suddenly we're talking about the defensive secondary as warmly as we've been talking about some of these other positions when it comes to the class of 2025. Now, before we're done on today's show, there is another point I want to make about the Earls commitment. And I think this is one of those things that sort of hides in plain sight a little bit. But I want to kind of contrast this with another major program here in the South, and I think you'll kind of see one of the reasons why you like Shamari Earls coming to Georgia even more so than just the fact that it's a good player and a flip from an SEC program and sort of the basic facts. There's a little bit more of an abstract conversation to be had about this, but I think it speaks pretty well if Georgia will do that here coming up in a moment. For now, let me remind you that's Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And obviously, we're enjoying that summertime of year, being outside. Our buddy Cody Chafin just got back from the beach. I've got my chance to kind of head towards Utopia of the Seas coming up next week and all the fun stuff going on with that. The point is, as you're heading towards the pool or going to the lake or doing all the fun stuff that you're doing here during the summer, don't forget our friends at Dr. Pepper got something great for you as you do all of that. A special flavor that, as far as I can tell, is perfect for the summer. For a limited time, you're going to enjoy the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. It just tastes like summer. And, of course, there's nothing better than to have all of that Dr. Pepper for all the things you're doing here during this time of year. But if you want that special treat to make your summer experience as fun as it can possibly be, make sure you try some Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut, some Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. And, of course, counting down the days, I know our friends at Dr. Pepper are before the start of the college football season because they're all a part of that with the Fansville commercials and everything else and the sponsorship of all the big games. And Dr. Pepper is just firmly entrenched into the world of college football. And now they're also helping you count down the days before we get to college football with Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut, Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. So if you're at a local Kroger or wherever you're doing your grocery shopping, just make sure you pick some up today. Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. Great to have Dr. Pepper bringing Around the Doghouse to us here today. Okay, so as I told you, we've got a couple of more recruiting notes before we're done. Finalists being dropped for David Sanders. That's interesting for a couple of reasons. Another note on Shamari Earls. Maybe possibly some bad news for Georgia on the recruiting front that's perhaps not 100% unexpected. We'll give you all of that before we wrap things up here today. But for now, on everything involving Georgia and the fun final days of this summer before the 2024 season arrives, let's talk to the former Georgia All-American Jon Stinchcomb here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let's say hello to Jon Stinchcomb. Always love his opinions here on DawgNation Daily. And, John, we have an interesting topic to address here for a moment. So Georgia just added a player named Jahzare Jackson. He's technically going to be a part of the class of 2024. He's going to be, I guess, an offensive lineman. But really, he's been a basketball player, part of the Overtime Elite program. This is a guy at 6'10" and 300-something pounds, had NBA draft aspirations, and now is going to try his hand at football. And he's at least impressive enough as a prospect that Georgia wants to take a flyer for him and bring him in right now to be an incoming freshman for Georgia here in this class of 2024. So can we talk about this from, I guess, both sides here for a moment, starting with the positive? what could a player who is at least good enough to be considered an NBA draft prospect, like he's played like AAU with like Bronny James, guys like that, what could a player who at least had some NBA draft potential, that kind of athleticism, what could that mean for him as he tries to now transition and I reckon play offensive tackle here? From the positive, how does that level of athleticism potentially help him?
Well, it's going to be the only thing that he can lean on as he transitions from basketball to football. I think your hope is he follows in a long line of guys that you've got big frames that are athletic, and you say, golly, we have to be able to find a spot for him. I've actually witnessed something very similar. There was a basketball player out of one of the Mississippi schools, Ole Miss or Mississippi State. His name was Jeremy Parnell. And originally it was defensive line, then defensive end, and tight end. He ended up playing tackle, and it's developmental, but there are some things, some traits that you just can't coach. That having a large human that's athletic, that's something that I can't coach. But if you give me that piece of clay, I can mold them into something that could be very productive. And for Parnell, he goes on and plays for the Cowboys and the Jags and was a perennial starter for them. And it wasn't because he had this long background in playing football. It's because he was a big man that was athletic and was coachable. And I think that's the hope for a guy like Ja, that he comes in and you say, we've had some really big offensive tackles in the past. Most recently, Amarius Mims. And others that are taller than your average, 6'4" to 6'6" offensive tackle. And we were able to develop their game to a point that was really productive. And for Ja, he is certainly a huge human and has shown on the basketball court to be pretty light on foot. So it's exciting to think. I think this is one of those opportunities that will get a coach like Coach Searles excited about what the potential might be. And it's probably down the road. I mean, this isn't a day one contributor. Obviously, he hasn't been a part of the game. But what it could be is exciting for everybody that's involved.
I'll tell you what it reminds me of a little bit is, for whatever reason, you ever see like one of the pictures when like an LSU recruit sees Shaq on the sideline for one of those games and sort of poses with Shaq? And sometimes these will be like defensive line or offensive line prospects. And like when they're posing with Shaq, they in some cases almost look like children in comparison to him. Now Shaq's like the biggest of the big, but like a big basketball player is just an unbelievably large human. And when we see Jackson in person, I think he's going to have that sort of like awe-inspiring, oh my gosh, I can't believe how big this guy is, that he's going to be like noticeably large in a way that even sometimes like more traditional football players, good sized traditional football players, they just don't quite have that same shock and awe of seeing the 6'10" guy who also kind of checks in at 340 pounds. It's just a different look, is it not?
It absolutely is. And just think of it this way, for your 6'4" player. So I haven't combed through the roster and figured out who exactly is 6'4", but he will be as close in height to Ja as he would your 5'10" cornerback, who is, probably on the shorter side. So that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective of the difference between what you're, close to what average might be across the offensive line and the way Ja will stand out. It's reminiscent of, in the land of super-sized humans, the years of Big O or Darnell Washington and Jordan Davis when they were on the roster, and you go, golly, these are really big humans, but they seem to stick out. I think the same will be said about Ja once he puts on the uniform. And
I want to talk about the other side of this too, but I will say that there's a part of me that the old school idea of like, first guy off the bus, things like that, I do sort of like as a Georgia fan, when you see Georgia doing its dog walk in a visiting stadium, I do sort of like the imposing figures that you see walking. There's a certain level of intimidation that comes from some of these guys getting off the bus. And we're going to talk about the challenges that a guy like this faces at Georgia here in a moment. But there's just sort of something to opposing fans, or in some cases, you just, even like the school itself. When you see these big guys getting off the bus, we're like, this is what we're playing today? This doesn't seem like too much fun. Like, I do sort of like the big guys getting off the bus sometimes.
Yeah, it's the Oakland Raiders approach because they always had the all-bus team where, the guys would hop off and you'd be like, what does that guy play? Is he a defensive end? He's like, no, that's a safety. So, there is a little bit of an intimidation factor when you have these supersized humans, just seeing them on the hoof, especially compared to the fact that you're used to seeing big folks. And when you have these anomalies, it is attention getting, not only from the fans, but as players. But, at the end of the day, you have to be able to produce and perform. And I think that's what the hope is for, any player that comes to Athens and is expected to contribute. And Ja will be no different in that, you look good, you look, intimidating, but we want you to be productive. And so it's a matter of, for Coach Searles and the rest of these guys, how quickly can we assimilate him into what we do and how we approach the game and make you a productive contributor more so than just an intimidator.
So on the flip side of this, just to be fair and balanced for a moment, and obviously we're going to give Jackson every chance he can to succeed, and certainly optimistic that he'd be able to do that. But is 6'10", is that going to be able to bend at the hips? Like how difficult is it to teach? And you, as you mentioned, you teach the offensive line positions. How difficult is it to teach someone that tall? The old adage that we've all heard about football, no matter what level you've played at, you've sort of heard the idea that the low man kind of wins. Can 6'10" become the low man in a battle? Because that's a lot of hip bend to get that low, is it not?
It is. And candidly, you have to teach technique different for a player of that height, that, his hands will have to be lower because he's not going to be able to get under some of these defensive ends and defensive tackles that he's expected to block. But they have a different challenge in that he's going to be a heck of a lot harder to get around. So, you watch film of guys like Bryant McKinney, who did it at such a great level, or Flozell Adams back in the day. More recently, Dan Skipper.
Yeah,
he played for the Lions. He had to work his way in, but he was an SEC guy. Dennis Rowland during his day, he played for the Cincinnati Bengals after he left Georgia. There have been other guys that are exceptionally tall, 6'10", 6'9", somewhere in that range, that you have to learn somewhat different techniques. I would not train an interior lineman who's 6'1", the same techniques that you're going to for a guy that's 6'10". And, for Jahzare Jackson, he's going to need to be able to utilize those opportunities where 6'10" and long arms, where I can reach out and touch a defensive end before he even gets out of his stance. You utilize those opportunities and then be able to compensate for those times where it might be a little bit of a disadvantage when you're talking about leverage. So there are certainly ways to compensate where it needs to be, but like anything else, I'd much rather have a guy that has freakish characteristics and learn ways to maximize those than somebody who might not have as high of a ceiling.
So we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's sort of a simple point, but sometimes the simplest points are, I guess, the truest, if truest is a word. Georgia got Shamari Earls this weekend. That's a 4-star defensive back, big body, long frame, flip him from South Carolina, sort of beat back Michigan for his services. And, John, it's just another example of what has been thus far a very successful recruiting summer for Georgia. And I think, as you and I probably talked about before, I know I've mentioned it plenty on the show, in light of transfer portal, in light of NIL, in light of all the changes we've seen around college athletics and the concern of, well, how are these things going to impact Georgia? The best evidence we have thus far is they're not impacting Georgia very much at all, that Georgia maintains this sort of business-as-usual approach to its recruiting success. And if you're a Georgia fan, I think you ought to take an incredible level of comfort in that. I believe that Georgia fans do take comfort in that, but an incredible level of comfort in that, knowing that Georgia is seemingly just as successful bringing in the big-time prospects now with, frankly, less playing time to offer and all that kind of stuff because of how deep the roster is, but still just as successful bringing in prospects as it ever was. The evidence we have right now is this recruiting machine for Georgia shows really no signs of slowing down.
And I would attribute it to the attention that they pay to it, the intention that they take with each player and each category that you just described, and the prioritization of recruiting. I think Coach Smart, from day one, when he came in, he has recognized we need the Jimmies and Joes. We need the players for this to be a nationally relevant program year in and year out. And all the pieces, all the categories that contribute to being a top-level recruiter, of developing a program, having facilities in place, obviously now with NIL being a factor there, being able to contribute and be a difference maker in that space, along with the development of players. We're going to compete for national championships. You're going to be nationally relevant. You're going to be nationally seen. You're going to be able to be recruited. It's nice to see David Jacobs, former teammate, right there with the 3 stripes on his sleeve. I know his son's a player, but great kid and good prospect, but also a DGD from back in the day. So he comes from good stock. But back to the case at hand of just overall recruiting. I think Coach Smart has taken that holistic approach, that there is no category left unattended, that there is an awareness of transfer portal. There is a constant awareness and recruitment of players that are in-house, and also seeing what's available. But for high school players specifically, that has been the bread and butter of this program, is identifying the best the nation has to offer, being competitive in all those various categories that are relevant, building relationships with the player, and then being able to close the deal. And year in and year out, you look at the top 3 recruiting classes, and Georgia's name is among them. And that's a credit to that entire organization, the entire program that's led by Kirby Smart, but demands the most attention from everyone involved, and has done so in a very successful way.
I want to ask you kind of a broad, open-ended question for a moment about Georgia on the field. We saw another example of Carson Beck earning some praise. He was predicted as the number 1 overall pick by Matt Miller the other day, the ESPN NFL draft analyst. I know what number 1 overall sort of looks like from a statistical standpoint. We have a little bit of a picture in our mind about that. But if Carson Beck this year really is playing his final season en route to being kind of a 1-1, number 1 overall pick in the first round of the 2025 draft, what does that sort of look like and feel like beyond just the stat line? What's that going to be like if Beck really is putting that kind of season together?
I think it's really bodes well for Georgia's productivity overall. Obviously great for Carson. Anytime you have that opportunity to be number 1 overall, it shows that all that investment that he made into the program, and sitting back and saying, I'm not transferring out. I believe in this process. And now it's paying off, and will pay off, a little less than a year from now when, the NFL draft comes around. I think that certainly sends a message to the rest of the players that might follow, that might come to the University of Georgia. But let's talk about the implications for this season. I think if he's able to put together those numbers, which means he's protecting the football, he's creating plays, he's proving what it takes to be that number 1 overall pick. One, he's not just a quote, a product of the Georgia system or whatever garbage was floated out a month ago by a national pundit who is clueless. But also, I think it shows that Georgia has the pieces around him and could put together a season that can highlight his ceiling and his upper level of play and competence. So if he is that number 1 pick, I think that means that Georgia is in line for one heck of a season and a national championship run. And I with the number of receivers we have, I think that's very well in the scope of possibility and probability for what Georgia's capable of this year.
We've got more with Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in just a moment. Before we get to that, though, I want to give a shout-out to our friends at Mr. Rooter and the work that Mr. Rooter is doing right now when it comes to all of your plumbing needs. Think about whole home water filtration and things like that. Mr. Rooter, they'll take care of your drain cleaning and repair. You got issue with your water heater, whatever else. They're going to get you covered, addressing your plumbing needs as quickly as possible for your residential, for your commercial needs, anything else in between. You can always count on Mr. Rooter for upfront pricing, flexible service options, and exceptional customer service. And one of the ways in which they demonstrate that is there's a $29 repair fee, but it's waived anytime you get some repair work done. That's why you need to find our friends at Mr. Rooter online. It's MrRooterGeorgia.com. That's MrRooterGeorgia.com. Neighborly company there to handle your plumbing emergency or just some sort of a quote on some work you know you need to get done. Anything like that, anything in between, commercial, residential, everything else. MrRooterGeorgia.com for more on that today. That's MrRooterGeorgia.com. All right, John, I want to finish with this if you don't mind. A week from today is SEC Media Days, which is kind of a big deal for the media, to be honest with you. But it's also kind of a cool corner poll to go around as we get closer to the start of the upcoming season. So I'm just sort of curious to kind of finish our conversation here today. Think about the rest of the SEC, whether it's the two new entrants into the league or Alabama post Nick Saban or an expanded playoff giving teams like perhaps Missouri or Ole Miss who've never been in a college football playoff a chance to really have a legitimate shot to be there. What's interesting to you about the SEC beyond Georgia right now? And if you were thinking about all of the questions that are about to be asked in Dallas, by the way, next week, what are maybe one or two of the big questions that come to mind for you about this very new look SEC for 2024?
Well, I think you hit on a couple of storylines. Obviously, the addition of the two new teams and their national relevance. But I think for every team, this expanded playoffs finally gives them a little hope. It's no longer you have to be that sole representative of the SEC or hope to be that second if there is one that's allowed out of the top four. I think it gives a lot of these teams something to play for that's a little more realistic. I think in years past, you're going, we'd have to get lucky if we're going to be honest of either upsetting Alabama or Georgia to be able to represent the SEC. And because of the expanded playoffs, I think there's more motivation throughout the entire season that if there is that singular slip up, that there is still hopes and real aspirations that can be achieved because of that college football playoff expansion. So I think there's plenty of discussion there. I also think it's going to be interesting to see exactly what happens with each other team. All right. Listening to
we got a little bit of sound. You got a little bit of sound coming through on that. Sorry about that, John. Go ahead, finish your point. I'm sorry.
Hey, no worries. I just didn't want to talk over him. No disrespect there.
No.
But obviously, I think it's going to be still, as you talk about all the different pieces across the SEC, what I always find enjoyable is the way that teams will circle back to Georgia.
Yeah.
And it's because they're the standard bearer. That you can talk about the addition of Oklahoma and Texas, and you can talk about the expansion of the college football playoffs. But at the end of the day, we all know that to win these championships, to get on that national level, it runs through Georgia. And so I find it enjoyable to hear the coaches and the players, as much as they want to not put Georgia and Bulldogs in their mouth and have that come out and say that matters, that boy does it. And so it's fun to hear the various shots that are taken and the commentary of, why they're relevant and on that same level when we all know that they're not yet. So it'll be fun. I look forward to it.
John, I think it's so well said, and a great conversation with you here today. We certainly appreciate your time. By the way, I hope you had a happy 4th of July. Is this the holiday where y'all typically put the slip and slide into the pond? Was that going on again this week?
That was it.
I love it.
Yep, we're 100 foot of tarp right into the pond. So the redneck slip and slide was in full effect. I've actually seen some folks have sent me clips of other slip and slides that a little more disastrous, but we were left relatively injury-free, had a great time, and hope all of Dog Nation did as well.
It does not get more American than that. John, good stuff. Enjoy the week. We'll look forward to talking to you here very soon on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
I always appreciate it. Go Dogs.
Yes, sir. Go Dogs.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Nothing better than a good sort of simple homespun 4th of July celebration, slip and slide right into the pond. That sounds like a pretty good way to celebrate all of that. Great stuff from Jon Stinchcomb there as well. Really, really strong. Certainly appreciate all of that. And now let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today. And many of you know, next week, getting a chance to be on board Utopia of the Seas, among the very first ever step foot on this ship before it kind of is welcomed by everybody for what's going to be the biggest weekend of them all. It's about 3 and 4 night sailings. So much fun. Last night, my wife and I were kind of watching some of the YouTube videos and things, Royal Caribbean over the course of time. And we show some of this to you on the screen here. Over the course of time, kind of puts out some of these videos to sort of let you know what the experience is going to be like. And we were watching some of those videos last night. It's kind of one of our traditions, and our whole family sort of like this when we're traveling. Watching some of those videos, just sort of getting excited about some of the stuff we're going to see. And what's fun about this is, to this point in time, a lot of the video content hasn't been created yet because, officially the ship hasn't sailed yet. We haven't gotten to Port Canaveral yet. And so some of the video content that's going to be so much fun to see is going to be actually shot and filmed while we're on next week. So I can't wait to come back and show a lot of that to you. And of course, this takes on extra importance for us because this great new ship, brand new Oasis class ship, is going to be the home for our Dog Nation cruise in 2025 there as well. So Jessica Slater, the one to get all this booked up with, you can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater@dreamvacations.com. It's going to be the biggest party at sea. Brand new, state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line Oasis class ship, specially built for those 3 and 4 night sailings going out of Port Canaveral. Sort of a drivable port for so many people, including myself. Although we are, I guess, flying this time. But typically sort of a drivable port for us. You get there and you have the quick sort of, long weekend cruise or 4-day, 4-night cruise. Great experience. It's our Dog Nation cruise in 2025. So can't wait to see you there. Jessica Slater going to help you out with all of that. And I'll look forward to coming back and telling you about it when I get a chance to set sail here next week. All right. Now, let's cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I want to start with this here for a moment, and I'm going to build to some recruiting news here. So I want you to keep something in mind here for a moment. We were just talking to Jon Stinchcomb about recruiting success for Georgia and all this kind of stuff, and I think most people are pretty aware of just how special this current time is for Georgia. In fact, one of the things that we hear a lot is that we're living in the current glory days for UGA. We have the benefit, what's the Andy Bernard line from The Office about you don't really know it while you're in it, but for most of us, I think we do have a certain sense of self-awareness that, gosh, it's never been this good for Georgia, and, history of college football would dictate it may never be this good again. Enjoy this period while you're in it. We sort of have that, I think, understanding as Georgia fans, because we know that whether it's 5 years from now or 25 years from now, at some point in time, Georgia will not be on the run of success, both in recruiting and on field, that it's on right now. Just everything sort of cycles eventually. There's always a certain life cycle for success, whether it's in business or sports or anything like that. And eventually, Georgia will be on a different rotation of its life cycle. We just sort of understand all of it. But here's the thing you also need to understand about that when that happens, and eventually it will, when that happens, there will be clues that it's about to happen. So just keep this in mind, that there will be clues before the collapse happens that it's about to happen. How do we know this? Because we see evidence of this here right now. I want to talk about 5-star offensive tackle David Sanders here for a moment. Now, it is not obvious that Sanders is going to go to Georgia. In fact, I think there are plenty of people that if they were placing bets would bet that Sanders doesn't go to UGA, a guy that Georgia would like to have, but you can't win them all, and Georgia may not win with David Sanders. That's certainly a possibility. But over the course of the last few months, when we have talked about David Sanders, what have we said about Sanders? For a long time, now we haven't said this as much lately, but for a long time, we were like Georgia versus Clemson, Georgia versus Clemson, Georgia versus Clemson. David Sanders is a big battle with Clemson. We said that so much for such a long time. Well, guess what? This weekend, David Sanders dropped his commitment date and his 4 finalists. I'll show this to you on the screen if you're watching on video. His 4 finalists for a commitment date of August 17th is Georgia, Tennessee, and Ohio State, and believe it or not, Nebraska. Guess what? Clemson didn't even make David Sanders' Final 4. Now, this may sound like it's just us sort of using an excuse to kick around Clemson, which is never a bad thing to do, I don't reckon. But in this particular case, that's not what we're doing. And it's not, as I said before, our intent to say, Georgia's dominating Clemson here and, whatever. Georgia may not win the decision for Sanders. Sanders may go elsewhere. Some people think he might go to Tennessee, perhaps Ohio State. It's not obvious that he's going to go to Georgia. But the fact that Clemson, after having sort of the inside track and sort of being viewed as sort of a dream school type situation, the fact that they don't even make the Final 4 for Sanders is a huge tell. This is, to me, that evidence of slippage that kind of as the forerunner for an outright collapse. And I just am telling you, that's what seems to be happening for Clemson. This program that was a fixture in the college football playoff for a long time and won a couple of national championships is now sort of out of the playoff picture. Nobody's belief of a true, legit national championship contender, I don't think. And now for recruits they were once thought to have an inside track with, not only are they not winning those commitments, because to be honest, they haven't been doing that for a couple of years, not only are they not winning those commitments, they're also now, in the case of Sanders, not even making the Final 4. That's the sort of evidence, slippage, that sort of acts as the forerunner for outright collapse. And in the case of Georgia, there was maybe an opportunity for this. As I told you before, Georgia had maybe a defensive backs coach didn't quite work out so well. Then a defensive backs coach maybe worked out a little too well. Now you had to replace him again. You bring in a guy like Dante Williams who, didn't, trying to very quickly get used to life here in the SEC. You've got a lot of defensive backs in the program. If we're being honest, a couple of those have had some sort of transfer rumors attached to their name, things like that. This was a chance for Georgia to show some slippage. This was a chance for Georgia to, perhaps, not have everything fall into place for it. But the fact that it went out there and won with Earls this weekend, the same way that it's been winning with guys like that for so many years, is an example that whatever Georgia is not slowing down anytime soon. And one of these days, maybe Georgia doesn't win the big recruiting battle. But that day is not today. Georgia stays Georgia when it comes to a guy like Shamari Earls. And in light of a program like Clemson being a far cry from its perennial playoff status and its national championship status, the fact that Georgia's not showing that degree of program slippage, that to me is fairly meaningful. And it's the kind of contrast that I believe you ought to draw here, whether Georgia ultimately wins with David Sanders or not. Now, one of the schools that was a finalist for Sanders that sort of thought to perhaps being throwing a lot of money around NIL right now is Tennessee. Does that help them with Sanders, and how true is all of this? I guess we're always left to wonder, but it's fair to point out there's also an online prediction today for a current Georgia commit, Jordan Perlotte, to flip his commitment from Georgia to Tennessee. That Tennessee could be on the verge here of flipping this Georgia commitment here. And this is not necessarily unexpected. I think there have been some people who've kind of thought for a while that Georgia's going to have a little bit of a hard time holding on to Perlotte. And it's one of the reasons why the Zayden Walker commitment was such a big deal. And frankly, what Georgia's been doing the linebacker position the last couple of years is perhaps such a big deal. I'll also say this, speaking of something being a big deal. I still think that Georgia versus Tennessee on the field this year is a pretty big deal. I don't know that flipping Perlotte is the kind of thing that ought to make you all that nervous necessarily, or winning with David Sanders ought to make you, if Tennessee does that, ought to make you all that nervous if you're a Georgia fan. But in light of Florida, who really for the most part is not lifting a finger at anything right now, and Auburn is sort of failure to launch thus far for Hugh Freeze. Maybe that changes this year, but thus far it's not exactly been an awe-inspiring start to the Freeze era. Tennessee is at least showing some signs of life. Their people do believe that Nico Iamaleava can have a good season. They are, winning some recruiting battles. They may win with Travis Smith here coming up towards the end of the week. That there's just there's at least some signs of life for Tennessee. So much so that if you ask me, what's the biggest game that Georgia will play in November? A lot of people would say a road game at Ole Miss. That's a tough game, regardless of whatever the Rebels' record turns out to be. But I believe the biggest game that Georgia plays in November is probably still Tennessee. I do. I think so. Because of the fact that Tennessee still wants to build, whether it be because of Josh Heupel as a coach, the program's NIL strength, or whatever else, they want to build something that has some staying power. That's why Georgia's blowout win in Knoxville last year was a pretty big deal, that it kind of smacked back any hope they had of being thought of in the same breath as Georgia. Certainly the game in 2022 was an example of that. I think that Georgia may be called upon to do something like that again here this year, to remove all doubt about Tennessee's hope of being even somewhat competitive with Georgia. I think the Georgia-Tennessee game in November, because of Tennessee's hope of being a rival to UGA, is the kind of game that probably ought to get more attention than it's currently getting. And if that's a game on the rise, then another game that's getting a lot of attention, perhaps it recedes into the background here a little bit. Once we get to November, the weather gets a little colder, I'm guessing we may be talking more about Georgia versus Tennessee than we are Georgia versus Ole Miss. Let's see if that ends up being true, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we wrap up here today, we had a really funny video. Not funny, it was fun video is what I mean to say. On Friday, we showed you of our good friend Cody Chaffins enjoying some well-earned vacation. Cody's, like all of our folks behind the scenes here, been working so hard for us, getting a chance to enjoy his time at the beach. And, of course, such a great accompaniment anytime you're out there enjoying the beach. How about some Finnish long drink? And the coveted peach can. That's what Cody's enjoying right there. The peach-flavored can. The peach-colored can, the peach flavor, limited time right here in the Peach State. That's what the Finnish long drink is all about. Now, you've also got the regular varieties there as well, the long drink cranberry, the long drink strong, long drink zero, no carbs, no sugar, the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. But the peach-flavored version is one of those things that people are seeking out, and when they find it, they are bragging about how great that tastes, and the contrast of that color with the beach in the background, the sand, makes me wish I was at the beach here right now. I know many of you feel probably the same way if you're lucky enough to be seeing that beautiful image there on video. So you can recreate this or your own version of that by going to thelongdrink.com. If you've never purchased it before, you're not really sure where to pick it up, if you'll put in your zip code there, you can find out where you can pick up some Finnish long drink today. That is online, thelongdrink.com. And, of course, one of the places where the Finnish long drink is a fixture is on golf courses. And speaking of golf courses, what else has been a fixture there on those on the PGA Tour for a long time? It's those Georgia Bulldogs. Another example of that yesterday as Davis Thompson won the John Deere Classic. 25-year-old winning his first PGA Tour event in his 63rd career start. As the PGA Tour reports, another win on tour for those dogs on tour. We think that's worthy of a golden shoe here today. Congratulations to Davis Thompson there on that. Lousy, stinking Gators, they're not winning PGA Tour events. They're not winning anything these days of note. It's been 1,339 days since they've beaten Georgia in football. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. Keep your eye on Jaylan Morgan, perhaps committing a little bit later on this afternoon. And, of course, following everything else going on there as well. See you tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They will do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. All right, let's get your comments here. We'll find out what's on your mind. I'm going to go to Facebook to begin things here today. We'll see how they're doing over there. Jahzare Jackson in the fold, maybe Jaylan Morgan before it's done. We shall see. Let us see what's going on here on the Facebook side. All right, your comments coming. Let's see what else. Zach Adams, Jacob O'Neill got a little classic country music lyric in here. I love that. William Camacho says, I do not Tennesseeing the Vol LOLs beating the Dogs. We're going to put them to shame like we have for so many years. Yeah, so it's not my prediction that Tennessee beats Georgia. I don't think they're able to do that. But it is my prediction that perhaps Georgia beating Tennessee will feel like a big game again here this year. And I've been kind of hinting at this for a while. I just sort of think that it's the game on the Georgia schedule that we're perhaps not talking about as much as we maybe need to. Also, a little love for the old NBA Jam video game in here, too. Let's see what else. You can't quite tell what's going on over here on Facebook here right now. Yeah, so a lot of chatter over here. Can't quite tell what all that's about. Zach Adams says Tennessee fans are they're going to be huge after their World Series win. Yeah, I'm guessing they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves after their really only athletic accomplishment thus far in the 21st century. You're probably right. Donovan Jackson said, I've been to the UGA U-Trash game, meaning the UT game, for the past 3 years, and I don't plan on breaking my streak. Well, there you go, Donovan. I love that. Be there, be loud, and be ready to go. I like that for sure. Ryan Mooney says it's going to be number one for the 2025 class before the summer's over. Ryan, you love that thought. David Wayne Carroll says, why not make the 6'10" dude a tight end, Darnell 2.0? Yeah, it would seem like that size, that height might be a little easier to kind of transition to the tight end position. That may be, as a basketball player, we've seen like Antonio Gates make that transition. I guess from a footwork standpoint, they sort of felt like he was a better fitted offensive tackle. It's an interesting prospect, right? And I guess the shining example of this is when I was a kid, do y'all remember Bernard Williams? I remember Bernard Williams for a couple of things. First of all, as a very tall player, perhaps not quite as tall as Jackson, but he's like 6'9" or something himself, I think. He, at the time, was the tallest player in Georgia history. He went on to become a first-round pick. I believe even back then, I guess the Eagles showing some love for UGA. Wasn't Bernard Williams a first-round pick of the Philadelphia Eagles? I think that's the case. The other thing is this is back in my day when I was going to all of the picture days and things like that. If some of y'all may remember this. Bernard Williams used to have the prettiest signature. Like I'm talking about like he would put John Hancock to shame. Just like this perfect handwriting, beautiful signature. I remember that from when I was a kid just because I used to have these framed autographs on my wall. Bernard Williams had this unbelievably pretty signature. Alan Verbanchik says he doesn't think the 2025 class will be number one. Perhaps not. Perhaps not. Matt Rukavina says, I just can't wait to tell Tennessee fans that Texas is the real UT. Just to twist the knife even more? Yeah, I'm sure that'll bother them for sure. Seems like I've already seen some arguing back and forth on social media about that a little bit lately. Oh, is this what this is? Is there like a spammer or something in here? I'm sorry. Y'all try to block that, I guess, if you can. Sorry about that, y'all. Let's go to YouTube for a second. Speaking of spammers. On YouTube, Paul Moon says, I always called Tennessee UT, but people told me Texas is UT. Anytime I can slide Tennessee, I do. Paul, that's a good philosophy to live by right there. Good philosophy to live by. Let's see what else. Woodland Revival says, I play this game Ultimate Golf on my phone. The other day, I randomly matched against a dude with a Gators avatar. Mine is the G. He took the L. Gators can't catch a W anywhere these days. I love to hear that. That's awesome. That's awesome. That's awesome. Jay Shibes taking an unprovoked attack at Matt Rukavina right now. So things are about the way they always are, I reckon. Joseph Medeiros says, I don't know why everyone thinks we drop a game. Undefeated season is on deck. So a lot of confidence coming from Joseph there. Yeah, I mean, I've obviously said that I think that 11-1 record is probably more likely just given the weight of the schedule, but to back up Joseph's point, this team is going to be a point spread favorite in each of these games, at least based on our current projections. So while the chances of winning them all pretty difficult, the chances of winning each game individually obviously sort of favor Georgia. So strong opinion, though, Joseph. I appreciate that. Let's see what else. Motivated Dedicated shouting out to Joseph for that strong opinion. He says he agrees, saying 12-0 again. Jonathan Aaron brings up a good point. He says even if he, talking about Jahzare Jackson, doesn't end up playing, regular offensive line, you can put him in there to block kicks and things like that. And that's actually a pretty good point. And, under the right circumstances, a player like that doing that could have some real value for you. That's a pretty interesting point. I wonder if that's Georgia's secret plan. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. James Richards says, what would be worse, losing to Bama or losing to Texas? Well, the fact that we're asking that question kind of gives you an idea of why this upcoming season is going to be so fascinating. And, I'll do on the one hand and on the other here for a moment. Like on the one hand, it's like Texas really thinks they're going to step into the SEC and be the class of the SEC. And, man, I really don't want that to be true. Really painful to think about losing that game to Texas. But on the other hand, to think that Alabama, with its first-year SEC coach, in his first SEC game, would prevent Georgia from getting revenge for last year's SEC championship and allow Kalen DeBoer to kind of have something to brag about so quickly in his Alabama career, I think that's probably the more painful of the two losses. I do. I think that's probably the more painful. But the fact that you would debate both of them so, I guess forcefully gives you an idea of just the sheer magnitude of the schedule that Georgia's about to play. Let's see what else. Yeah, Mark Woodmansee says losing to Bama would be the worst loss. As Saban is gone, we need to go and beat. He says something a little bit more colorful than I will. But there you go. I think you may be right about that. Matt Rukavina now has migrated over to YouTube to say that he's in the eye of the hurricane. The generator's up and running. He goes, I got a whole mess of smack to talk. So there you go for Matt. Well, sure enough, Matt, stay safe over there as Barrel kind of gets ready to beat down on Texas. So please stay safe there for sure. Good to see our buddy Army Dog Charlie in the comment section. I think he was here. Was it Friday he was here? I think I briefly saw him. So happy to see Army Dog back with us. A great guy. A great guy for sure. Let's see what else. Lance D also says the loss to Bama would hurt the most. Yeah, so I think a lot of people are going to end up agreeing with that point. I think you're right. Taylor Russell says it is the toughest schedule in Georgia history. I believe you're right about that. Foster Moss says 6'10". We need that demigod defensive tackle. That's all about the batted balls he would have. Yeah, a lot of people like the idea of the big frame, a guy that's, played the post, knowing how to block shots, knowing how to go up for rebounds. Could be some real value in that. You almost wonder, too, like a 2-point conversion. Could he just go up and high point it for a 2-point conversion? Perhaps he could. All right, let's see what else. Good to see Mike in the comment section and here chatting it up with folks. Tim Harrell says Jackson's size as a player is like what I would have built into an NCAA EA Sports video game player. Yeah, that's probably about right. By the way, we're only a few days away from that. K-Shad talking about some drinking game stuff. Yeah, one of the things that, there are certain little phrases that I do probably use pretty frequently that if you kind of did a drinking game around those, you might be in some real trouble. Let's see what else. Yeah, a lot of good comments in here. How about this from Brodo Baggins, who says, I'm going to the Alabama game, the Texas game, the Ole Miss game, and the Tennessee game all next year. That's a pretty good slate of games to be going to right there for sure. Randy Hall on the subject of Jaden Perlotte perhaps getting some money from Tennessee. maybe that's the case. DT says, seems like the Dogs walked away from Perlotte. Dogs will upgrade. Yeah, I don't know about that. Scott Harris says, can you be the favorite without being the point spread favorite? What's the difference? I'd say that in most cases we call somebody the favorite. What we're referencing is the point spread favorite. Now, there's also a thing you see on TV sometimes where the average TV talking head sometimes doesn't understand, who truly is the favorite. In other words, there are a few examples in most years of an unranked team being favored over a ranked team. And, a lot of the talking heads on TV don't realize the unranked team is favored. And so, therefore, they would treat it as an upset if the ranked team lost, but the non-ranked team was expected to win the game anyway. You see this in the NCAA tournament sometimes, too, where it's like, in like a 7-10 matchup or even like a 6-11 matchup, a 6 seed against 11 seed, sometimes the 11 seed will be favored. And, the talking head on TV, if the 6 seed loses, well, they treat that as an upset. But, people who kind of, sort of the if you know type people, they sort of realize, well, actually the other team was sort of favored to begin with. So when we say favorite, we typically mean point spread favorite. On TV sometimes, the notion of favor and underdog is sort of based on the perception of the two teams, perhaps not backed up by reality. Let's see what else. JP says, I think the reason the Tennessee talk about that upcoming game is less right now is because it slid in November and there's so much in front of them right now, including Bama, Texas, and Ole Miss. I think the game will get bigger as it gets closer. I think you're probably right about that. I think also the newness of this year's schedule has kind of sucked a lot of this comes across as negative. I don't mean for it to sound that way, but it's taken the oxygen out of some other conversations, and probably for a good reason. Georgia fans are excited about playing Alabama, a kind of a rare regular season matchup. Certainly excited about playing Texas, a very interesting, game. And so some of the games we would obviously be talking more about, we're just not talking about them as much because there is so much conversation going to some of these other games. Let's do a couple more comments here. Let's see what else. Scott Harris says, I've said for the last 3 years that Clemson's issues are along the offensive line. Yeah, they've had a very hard time, populating the roster. These are just hard recruitments. You've got to be really committed to playing the game over a period of years. For whatever reason, offensive and defensive line recruiting are sort of multi-year efforts. And Clemson just does not have that kind of commitment to recruiting. And there's a lot about Dabo Swinney that I like. I'm not super anti-Swinney because I think that Dabo's probably a pretty good dude. But I do think his sort of set in his ways as a coach has hurt them in the recruiting world. Let's see what else. Yeah, a little NBA. I see a little NBA. There you go. How about that for the NBA Jam duo right there, Jeff Sintel and me? I love that. That's pretty good stuff right there. I used to love NBA Jam. I've never been a huge video game player. By the way, Jeff gets the speed nod over me. That's probably fair. Jeff gets the 3-point percentage edge over me. No way that's true. I'm fairly confident I'm a better shooter than Jeff is. They're saying Jeff can't dunk. They're saying I can. I would say, by the way, great work by Cody Chaffins on this. I would say that my dunking is probably very much overrated, unless it's an 8-foot goal. I can still dunk an 8-foot goal. I am not going to come close to dunking a 10-foot goal. But I'm probably a better shooter than Jeff is. He almost certainly is a better defender than me. What's the phrase you sometimes hear on scouting reports? I don't know that I would be considered a willing defender. I'm a little bit more. I'm a lot more active on one end of the floor than I am on the other end of the floor, if you get my point. I don't know how willing of a defender I am right now, but I'm an okay shooter. I'm probably a better like mid-range jumper. Like the analytics age has kind of ruined guys like me because the analytics age would say, hey, don't take the long two, but kind of like the long sort of mid-range two. That's the sort of shot that I excel in. So I'm an okay jump shooter. I am not very speedy. I am not going to dunk unless it's an 8-foot goal. And defense, I'm sort of defense optional. But I do love the throwback graphic there on that. Big fan of NBA Jam. Really, really fun. One of the few video games that I did like, for sure. That's really good. That's really very clever. Very clever. Let's see what else. Dave Snow, by the way, also likes the idea of Jackson blocking some kicks. I think y'all are onto it with that. And who knows, maybe that's what it ends up being. I mean, do you know how beloved Jahzare Jackson would be at Georgia if all he ever did was block field goals? Like if he just came in as like the field goal blocking menace. And do you know how mad Georgia's opposition would be about that? Because, there's already all these rules about, you can't like, what they call like leaping. You can't leap over the pile. You can't, like, how you do in the pool if you're playing like one of those like, jackpot games or something like that, where like you try to like put your hand on somebody's shoulder, push off on the shoulder to get even higher. You can't do that anymore in football. That's a penalty. But there is no penalty about just being 6'10" and just blocking the field goal. Do you know how mad people would be if Georgia took advantage of that inefficiency and just had some dude swatting footballs out of the air, Lorenzo Carter style? Think about that from the 2017 Rose Bowl, I guess January 1st, 2018. And then who blocked the other big kick against Bama? Was it Bama in 2021? Somebody had the big block kick. Who was that? There was a big block kick there in that too. Was that Jaylan Carter that did that? I don't know. My brain's fried. But that'd be a real weapon. Because there's so many rules these days that prevent that. Now, it's sort of like, with all due respect, it's a little bit like putting the fat guy at goalie that, if you don't have the requisite athleticism, then maybe that kind of invites the fakes and things like that. Maybe teams would use that as a way of, working around the situation a little bit. But I'm telling you, I wasn't really thinking this way. I think Devontae Wyatt, was it field goal? Was it a field goal block against Alabama? Is that what that was? Am I right? Yeah. So Jaylan Carter got the block. Yeah. So there you go. I had at least a partial memory of that. But the big one to me is always the Lorenzo Carter, big long frame, big block when Georgia really needed it. Really exciting. Although the Carter one was also a big deal too. Rome Dog wondering about Brent Key having some say in moving the Georgia Tech game to Black Friday. Yeah, I wonder about that. And we also had the reporting the other day that Clemson rejected the chance to play on Black Friday. So if that's true, is Georgia on Black Friday because Clemson turned it down and felt like it had the ability to turn it down because it's on its way out of the ACC, at least in its own mind? I don't know. A lot of that's kind of weird. All right, final comments. Ready to wrap it up for today. Rambo mentioning the fact that Boss Bailey could also block some kicks. Yeah, one of my favorite photos in Georgia football history, and this used to hang in the old press box. I'm guessing they probably have new photos in the new press box. But it was the Boss Bailey field goal block against Tennessee in 2002. Tennessee was wearing one of the most heinous uniforms you'll ever see, white with a big, wide orange stripe going down the jersey and the pants. Ugly. I'm just talking about ugly, just like an affront to humanity. So ugly. But like on the field goal block, I mean, Bailey's way up in the air on that thing. Rambo says 40-inch vertically. I mean, he used every inch of it on that field goal block. It was really something to see. Really something to see. That's a really fun field goal block for sure. And he had a lot of moments like that. But that Tennessee game in 2002 is always etched in my memory because I would see that picture all the time. All right, final comments over here at YouTube. Let's see what else. Stick D says, is Georgia going to black out on Black Friday? I certainly hope they do. Now, sometimes Kirby kind of avoids that kind of stuff, but it just seems like a fun thing to do. Sort of a perfect scenario to do it, you would certainly think. Taylor Russell, shouting out Lorenzo Carter. The big one I'll always remember is that Rose Bowl game. One of the great games, really in college football history, but certainly Georgia football history. Let's see what else. Foster Moss also likes the idea of the blackout for Black Friday. That'd be fun. So here's Boss Bailey. Look how high that is. I mean, look how high in the air that. What a photo. Good job, Cody. What a photo that is. And y'all, how ugly are those Tennessee uniforms? Like, the impressive athleticism for Bailey is the diametric opposite of just the sheer terror of those Tennessee football uniforms. Like that's low-key almost as bad as Georgia's 2011 Boise State uniform. Like that wide stripe. For whatever reason, the wide stripe I just find offensive. That orange, like orange is bad enough as it is, but when you have it trimmed in black, somehow it makes the orange look even worse, I believe. That's really a bad uniform. It's a very bad uniform. I think some of the stuff that Tennessee's wearing these days is not quite as bad. I do think that I don't always love what Nike does with the Georgia red, but I will admit that Nike has improved the Tennessee orange. I do think they've found a nicer hue of the orange for Tennessee now. So yeah, that's an amazing picture. Boss Bailey, just amazing. Amazing. So good stuff here on YouTube. Let me see if I get anything else going on here. Baggins and Friends reminding folks hit the like button. We always appreciate when you do that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mark Woodman said Jalen Carter had 2 blocks, Alabama, LSU, and also Kentucky, I believe. Yeah, pound for pound, one of the best football players Georgia's ever had. Just really, really something from a talent standpoint for sure. Craig Jones says he's going to get tickets to the Georgia Tech game, and he's still got a black number 7 jersey. So there you go. That's pretty good stuff right there. Pretty good stuff. All right, we're going to wrap it up for today. Appreciate you being here. Y'all find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com. It's very hot. Make sure your air conditioning unit stays running the way that it's supposed to as the summer and the intensity of the summer still looms large. So do all of that. Also, if your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. That's always a good thing there, too. So please find them online at rsandrews.com. We will see you back here tomorrow as well. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window in Door of Georgia. Perhaps another commit to talk about, and a lot of fun in the days to come, including some really interesting recruiting rumors that are also kind of floating around a little bit there, too. So we'll keep our eye on all of that. See you back here tomorrow for our R.S. Andrews cool down when it's all said and done. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window of Georgia. Before that, see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow.